Thank you, Bruce, very much for that kind introduction. And it is true that when you take these jobs, and I must admit that this is my third one, the third time that I joined the United States government doing something like this. So I've spent 10 years doing it, including my son is the one that is beginning to wonder about my sanity, because there is, you can overdo these things too. But it's when I was invited to take the job to represent the United States to the EU, which includes, of course, 25 countries, that appeared to be an incredible challenge. And to the United States, and in the United States Diplomatic Corps is one of the key diplomatic posts in the world. Back many, many ages ago, during the Venetian days, somebody was asked what an ambassador actually does, and he received an answer, and the answer was from a British diplomat, and he said basically an ambassador is an honest man who is sent abroad to lie for his country. So that is the explanation of what an ambassador is. What is interesting too is that when I volunteered to do this originally during the Reagan administration, and I went to Finland as the ambassador for the United States prior to the downfall of the Berlin Wall, the 3 years. Incredibly interesting time to have been there, of course. And the last 3 years in Europe, the last 4 years in Europe, has also been a very, very interesting time to have been representing the United States. Why do you do these things? I think that anybody and everybody has a shot at it, if you wish. That's what this country is all about. I'm an immigrant, and I had a knowledge of English when I arrived here. Actually studied American English my first few years that I was here, and it's doable. It's not something that you can't do. It's a function of deciding that you want to do it, and then you go do it. And I was very fortunate to get the call from the President to take this particular job because it turned out to be incredibly fascinating. What I found out, however, was that when I went around and talked to people about the EU, many of my own friends said, what is the EU? What do they do? Where are they located? Do we have an embassy there? Et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of questions I was getting from people that were relatively well educated. And after I realized, and there are statistics out, that 75 to 80% of people in America basically do not know what the EU is. They know Europe, they know Paris, London, etc. But they don't know what the EU necessarily is. It's some organization that does some things that are quite important, and maybe they know it's located in Brussels, but that's about it. We have 3 ambassadors actually in Brussels, one representing the United States to the country of Belgium, handles everything between those two, then one to NATO, which is of course security, military, and one to the EU. And clearly that EU job has been growing very rapidly because, for one thing, the EU is growing very rapidly. And while I was there, 10 new countries joined. And of course there are 6 or 7 other countries that are standing in line to join in due course. But I did realize that when I went around to find out how many people knew something about the EU and learned that, I thought, well, maybe if this is so important to us, the US, and to the world, that relationship, if there are a lot of people that simply don't know what it's all about, maybe I ought to write a book about it. And I was not an author, and I'm not a writer, even though I have a father who is a publisher and a writer. But I never had, but I got somebody to help me with it and knew we had a message. The message simply is that what we cannot do in the United States is to put our head in the sand and think that Europe will never get their act together, because there are 25 countries with 25 different languages, with 25 cultures, etc. All the reasons why you may think that they're not getting their act together, while in the meantime they have accomplished tremendous amounts of things in the last 50 years. That is how long the EU, with a different name at one point, has been around and has been working. And their stated goal today is to become the most competitive economy in the world. And when you say who competitive to whom, then of course you would immediately know that that would be us. And they are writing rules and regulations every day by the minute that are competitive with the United States, and their influence in the world is growing by the minute, even though that influence is not one of a military sort. It is of a different sort. It's an economic sort. The Europeans, the EU is helping tremendously with developing countries. As we do, Europe does it a different way. We have the same set of values essentially, but we have two different cultures and we approach things differently. So in any event, the book came out of that sort of thinking, and what I'd like to do with you today is just to give you a quick rundown as to what the EU is all about, why it's important. And mentioned the number of countries, of course. You're talking about a 450 million population, and you're talking about an economy that is basically the size of the United States. When I arrived there, the General Electric company was trying to buy a company in the United States called Honeywell. And they had been approved by our regulatory authorities to, in effect, make that acquisition. And the head of General Electric, whom I understand has spoken here, Jack Welch, not so long ago, very well-known international businessman, he found out that the EU, of all things, could turn down this acquisition, which was going to be kind of the crowning acquisition in his career. And he said, well, who is this? What is this EU business? Well, the fact of the matter is, they turned it down. They never made the acquisition. And it is in the courts today. And somebody like the General Electric CEO woke up to the fact that indeed the EU had enormous powers that he wasn't aware of, and apparently his people weren't totally either. The new CEO today of General Electric figured it out fairly quickly and moved his headquarters from London to Brussels sort of in the first year that he was in the job, recognizing that he needed to be there, and lots of other companies, of course, are there today as well. So let me give you a bit of a history. As I mentioned, 50 years ago it started after the Second World War with a great deal of support from the United States. The reason was that Europe had been fighting within Europe during two major world wars, as you know. So the major reason was to preserve peace. The idea was if you worked together and you did business together and traded together, you probably wouldn't fight each other. And that, of course, has worked. There have been wars of major proportions in Europe in the last 50 years. The other part of that plan was to build prosperity, i.e. to build growing and successful economies. In the process, they have achieved that. They have achieved building a very successful economy. And with that, of course, goes the thinking that maybe once you accomplish that, that you also ought to be playing a bigger role as an EU in the world affairs in general, foreign policy, and obviously, ultimately, military power as well, which they are working on today. So the competitiveness of Europe during this period has been growing tremendously, and a lot of the new rules and regulations are being written in Brussels today, in many cases directly competitive with the United States. Again, we need to know about that. You have a structure that to a lot of people is very complex in Europe. You have commissioners, you have a council, you have a parliament. But when you look at that and when you figure it all out, you find out that it's not that much more complex than what we have in the United States. If you try to deal with the United States government in a lot of different areas, you find that there is tremendous overlap in the different departments that have become established over many, many, many years. It's not simple. It's not simple, and that is why you have so many lawyers in Washington, so many lobbyists in Washington, people that try to help people that want to work within that area, because it is complex. And I was, at one point, as was mentioned, I ran the Department of Commerce, which was 35,000 people or so with a fairly large budget. And I'll tell you, it was so complex that you could basically spend the rest of your life trying to figure out what all they did. But they did a lot of things that were, in effect, being done in other departments as well. So to deal with the U.S. government, not simple. And Europe isn't either. The number of lobbyists in Europe today is over 20,000, so business recognizes that what's going on there, they better know about, and they are being represented there. The new countries that are standing in line, you've read about it recently. One of them is Turkey. That basically has changed dramatically, but they've been talking for 40 some odd years about Turkey starting negotiations to get into the EU. And as of a week or two ago, that process has now started, and it may take another 10 years to arrive at a time that Turkey would be voted into the club. This club is attractive to people. The Ukraine had a revolution not long ago, as you know. One of the first things that the president of the Ukraine did was to meet with President Bush about joining NATO and to meet with the European leadership about joining the EU. I have gone to all these countries, to the Bulgarias of this world, where you used to think that nothing was going on that was of any interest. These countries are booming in anticipation of joining the European Union. Recently, we have read about the disaster or crisis, which is in existence, and I'll go into that a little bit, but that was basically perpetrated by the down vote, the no vote on the Constitution. So 3 years ago, there was a group of people within the EU that started writing a constitution for the EU, which was simply bringing together all the various treaties on which this EU is built over the years to put them into one and make it more streamlined, make it easier to operate. That process took a long time with a lot of input, and then people in Europe needed to go through a vote to either say yes or no to the Constitution. A number of countries have voted for it. A number of parliaments have voted for it. In France, what happened was there was a referendum. People could vote. They did, and they turned it down. The reason they turned it down was that, first of all, they didn't understand it. People just basically didn't understand the Constitution. And second of all, they felt removed from all this activity in Brussels, where people were writing rules that were affecting them, but they weren't directly voting people into those offices. So a misunderstanding, but ultimately the biggest thing was the economy. People in France are not finding jobs and took this as a way to vote against a regime run by Mr. Chirac, who was not creating the jobs. And what they're doing is they're still doing or attempting to get an economy turned around with the old ways being, and same thing in Germany, by the way, we've gone through a major election there within the last month, that the problem is that there is no growth in those countries, and they are trying to run the economies like they used to use them in the old days. The social model, where basically you were taken care of from cradle to grave, is great and is wonderful, but it doesn't work anymore. It's simply, you cannot have this incredible, wonderful environment that you have in Germany, where if you were out of a job, that you were basically doing as well as when you were in the job, while you are at the same time competing with people in India and in China that are working at costs. And to give you an example, in France, an average textile worker is paid roughly $20 an hour. In China, they get 50 cents. And then you have a whole bunch of countries in between. Turkey, you get $3. Bulgaria, you get $1. You're competing with those people. The fact of the matter is, we're living in an open society, in a globalized world, so you can no longer compete. So what happens is, the Germans are going to have to work longer hours at less pay in order to keep their economies going. If they don't, what happens is the companies move out. They move next door to Poland, to Hungary, to the Czech Republic, to wherever, because the competitiveness in the world is so severe that they can't compete with the Chinese product. And we see that in the United States as well, of course. Tremendous inflow of products into the United States. We have to come up with ways to compete with that. So the changes that are going on and these votes that are going on right now is basically, do you believe in an open market or do you believe in a state-controlled system? That's kind of what it amounts to in France and in Germany. And the fact is that the state-controlled system no longer works. We have gone in the United States through a period of major change, major re-engineering of companies in the 80s. That is why our companies are competitive today. And that is also why we have job growth and we have growth in the economy. Now, there may be questions as to what kind of jobs, how do they pay, all of those things, very valid points. However, ultimately, and that needs to be addressed, of course, but those people are working and we can compete with some of the other countries in the world, whereas the Germanys and the Frances cannot. Or it's much more difficult. So when I mentioned the crisis, there is a crisis. So that thing was, the referendum voted down the Commission and everybody threw up their arms and said, my God, this is the end of the EU. But particularly people in this country, and I think that the press wrote about it very, very much, about here's another case of the European system not working. The fact of the matter is the EU has worked without this constitution all this time and continues to work and is doing quite well even without it. And ultimately they will come up with a constitution that may be changed a bit. There will be a time for a reflection, but it'll come back. There's actually been a country since that vote that has voted for the constitution, which was Luxembourg, small, but nonetheless, it was done. So they are going through a crisis. And frequently, what a crisis does for you, it creates an opportunity. And what Europe needs to do, and that is what you saw in the elections recently in Germany. There was an election that took place between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democratic Party. The Christian Democratic Party that was run, the candidate, was a woman who was brought up in East Germany. She has credentials somewhat alike Mrs. Thatcher. She actually has a degree, a doctorate in, a PhD in chemistry, I believe it is. And she thinks somewhat like her. She believes that the social system that exists in Germany and has existed, those rules are no longer sacrosanct. That you have got to find a way to get away from that in order to be creative and create an economy that is going to grow, that will create jobs and will take care of pensions, etc. So she won by a very, very, very small margin. But that is the battle. The battle is the old system versus the new system. It is the dirigiste that the French talk about, where things are controlled at the government level, versus the more Anglo-Saxon model that believes in open and free markets. And that last model ultimately is going to win the battle, because they are the ones that are going to have to compete with people in China that are paid 50 cents an hour. I don't know what they are in India, but I don't think they're much greater. So they need to restructure in Europe, and everybody is aware of it, and the voters are too, by the way. And people in Germany, the Socialist Party, in effect, was already making changes. Mr. Schroeder was already doing it. It is that the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats, wanted to do it more aggressively. So you now have a grand coalition that will work things out between them, hopefully, but the changes have to be made and will be made. And we're talking here about labor reform, which means that it is easier to lay people off without it costing you forever. The interesting part about it is, even though it sounds crude and difficult, the fact of the matter is, in Ireland, they have changed their entire system around, including the labor laws, and they have created an economy that was doing extremely poorly, as you well know. The Irish was one of the poorest countries in Europe. They have changed things around so that today the Irish are coming back home to take the jobs that have been created by a new type of an economy. And that may happen with Turkey. Turkey is changing things dramatically. The Turks have left Turkey to go work in Europe for many, many, many years. When I was there recently, the Turkish at universities like this, the Turks were talking about, listen, if this thing continues and our economy continues, the growth of jobs, many of the Turks in Germany may well come back. Because ultimately people would like to be in their own country, but they couldn't find jobs heretofore. Now the thing has changed. Those are the things that they need to change in Europe as well. The Commission that is running the EU is more of a right-of-center pro-business commission. They're talking about doing away with a lot of the regulation that is stifling the economy. Whether they can get that through or not remains to be seen, but that is the driver. And ultimately with the idea in mind that unless and until we do away with some of these labor laws, rules and regulations to open up the economy, that's the only way to get people back to work. And when you have a system, that has created 20 million unemployed in Europe, people of course sit around and recognize that there's something wrong with this and that something must be changed. So that is what is going on. Somebody asked earlier, I believe it was the Chancellor that mentioned, do more people know about the euro than the EU, which is a very interesting question because the euro, of course, is the money, is their dollar. And it was, somebody won the Nobel Prize for coming up with the idea of a joint currency, and who was Dr. Robert Mundell, who's a professor now at Columbia, but is speaking all over the world about his next idea, and that is a global currency. So everybody told there was no way that the euro could exist. It is in business today and it's very successful. 300 million plus people are using it. More and more countries are using it as a reserve currency. People in Russia are saving, 20%, 25% of the people are saving in euros as opposed to other currencies, including their own and the dollar, of course. So it has been a success, and he is now talking long-term thinking, of course. Why could you not have a world currency as opposed to all these fluctuating currencies all over the world? As a quick aside, when he received his Nobel Prize in this magnificent setting, he was giving a speech to all the white-tied dignitaries, and right in the middle of the speech, when he had said what he wanted to say, he said, well, I have to finish my speech in a slightly different way. And he started to sing the Frank Sinatra song that said, I did it my way. And here's a guy that came out of Canada with no very, very poor, and so on and so forth. And here he was standing in front of this august body of people, and he sang his song, and he said, I did it my way, and here he is. I mean, great, great story. And now he's thinking out of the box, about a world currency. And everybody said he's crazy. And I've been to his house, his castle in Siena, Italy, where he talks about that. It's kind of like a Fellini movie. It is, I mean, the guy is totally, I mean, it's fabulous to go there. And there sit around the table 20 great minds. Mine was an exception to that, of course, but I was sitting sort of in the back of the room, talking about a world currency. And they said it couldn't be done. They also said that the EU couldn't be done. There have been all sorts of people, including great economists in the United States, that said, and by the way, Mr. Kissinger was one of the people, not an economist maybe, but who said the euro will never work. And there were all sorts of people that kind of laughed off the thought about the EU becoming what it is today. And yet, it is incredibly powerful, and this is where the title of my book comes from, The Next Superpower, question mark. But it actually already is a superpower affecting our lives. The euro is supported by the European Central Bank, whose mission is to protect the currency and to fight inflation. Very different than our central bank. Our central bank is involved in affecting monetary policy so as to influence and help the economy. So when they brought interest rates down when we were in the middle of a recession some time ago down to very, very low rates, that was the beginning of a turn in our economy. And now they're going back up again because the economy has worked. The ECB, the European Central Bank, is not in that business. They remember the Weimar Republic in the beginning of last century, where actually my family grew up, where the German mark became totally worthless because of inflation. So the Germans they're very aware of the threat and the problem of inflation. And that is something that we are looking at today. Again, when you look at your papers today that we're talking about inflation, I'm sure that the UCLA report talked about that too, that just recently came out as being a major problem. The European Central Bank focuses on that, so they're there to protect the currency from that sort of thing happening again, and it comes from that experience. I've mentioned the Irish example to you. It has worked. I've mentioned briefly the internal competition between the new 10 countries, for instance, and the Polands and the Germanys. If you sit in Austria, for instance, you drive from Vienna to Bratislava, which is the capital of Slovakia, in an hour. Speed, you know, it's 80 miles, 70 miles, whatever. And in Bratislava, they're operating with a 20% tax rate, flat tax rate, which of course we are talking about in this country today, potential of that. I don't know what will ever happen, but that is what we are discussing also in the think tanks. Bratislava competing with Vienna next door. Vienna has a 35-6% corporate rate. What do they have to do, and what did they do? They brought down their corporate rates. How can you compete when you're next door to Slovakia, where there are people that are hungry, willing to work? They don't put 35-hour work weeks in Slovakia, just like they don't in China or India. People don't talk about that. They're talking about building wealth. They're talking about sending their children to schools. They're talking about creating or buying houses and things like that. They're not talking about cutting down their work week. And you get to a point where you can say, well, I'm going to work only 20 hours a week. Well, that's perfectly fine, but you're going to have to pay a price for that. And that is the kind of problem that you're faced with in Germany today. But you have this internal competition, which is, in my judgment, very positive for Europe. And that's why, ultimately, I am a believer in the EU. And I think that these new countries, including the Irelands, the new member, relative, the 10 new countries that came in, the Spains of this world, that are competing with the older systems, ultimately will win out. Because you can buy product today all over Europe. You don't have to buy your car in Germany. You can actually buy it in Ireland on the internet. And so you don't have these protective markets anymore. So you have internal competition that's helping Europe to change. And I think ultimately that will be beneficial. In addition to that, you have this restructuring that I mentioned that the Commission is working on very hard and looking at all the regulatory processes that are not working so well. So they have to cut back on them. Ultimately, what you want is a Europe that is strong, that is a strong partner to the United States. The two of us have 60+% of the world GDP. We can together approach, based on similar values, we can approach the problems of the world that are today global poverty, and yes, the environment, and yes, terrorism. And that is why it is so incredibly important that we work together and that we don't get caught up in battles over the size of bananas or who can buy beef. I mean the trade issues that you read about all day long. We've got much bigger and much more important things to talk about. The Europeans today are saving dramatically more than we do. They have an incredible pent-up demand from the consumer side because they haven't been spending. We spend big time. Our consumer is 2/3, 70% of the economy. Europe is really lagging, but they've got much more money in their pockets. One of these days, when the confidence of the average European comes back, he and she will also be getting into the consumer business, which of course ultimately everybody likes to be, I guess. But you need to have certainty. You need to know how things look in the future, your job certainty and things like that. I think once they start to make these changes and the economy starts to create jobs that people in effect will start consuming, and that of course again is the driver in the United States economy, which is very, very key. So I think that that's essentially what I wanted to say. I don't want to over talk because you may have some questions that you want to answer. But bottom line, I believe that ultimately Europe will change to come up with a stronger and more creative economy, which means they have to change and get away from the social welfare system that they have known, which has been great, but can no longer afford when you're competing with the rest of the world. I think it's vitally important for us to be partners to work at the issues of tremendous importance in the world, and that is, to start with, of course, global poverty, from which come a lot of the problems in the world. We are working on that. The United States recently in the Doha round, which is really specifically a round that says for the developing countries to be able to move product, sell product into the United States and Europe, that round is going on. And we have just put on the table something that had to do with protecting our agriculture and that of Europe. If we protect we subsidize our agriculture and that of Europe, the lesser developed countries, from Africa to South America to other places in the world, can't sell their products because they can't compete when you have a product that's subsidized. We have to get away from that. It's one of the major problems. We have to do it jointly. We put something on the table, the Europeans are receiving that and they're going to counter, and hopefully something soon will come out of that, and by soon I mean within the next year or two, so as to address that problem, which will help the lesser developed countries come out of their poverty. We have just to conclude, we need to address that. We are together. We have the issue of the Middle East, which of course is incredibly important with what's going on today. We are fighting terrorism, and there are reasons for that. We have to understand why there is terrorism. We have to address those issues, and again, we can do it together. Palestine-Israel, the conflict there is incredible. It's based on history, of course. We need to do that together. And then the issue of economic growth in the world. Dr. Rice recently said, we support, the U.S. supports the democratic aspirations of all people. And that is what you see around the world, and that is the message that the United States has been putting out there. But that's true, of course, with Europe as well. So they have to change a number of different things so as to create growth. We are there to work with Europe to address the major issues of the world. And that is kind of the story of the book. So it says, what is the EU? Why is it around? Why is it important? And why is it important to not only Europe, but to the United States and to the world at large? So I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them. Thank you for your attention.